It all comes down to Donbass. Russia and Ukraine have been fighting over the resources-rich territory for more than a decade. And now, reportedly, it's the only thing preventing a peace deal. Russia controls the majority of the hotly contested region. Should Ukraine give up the rest in return for peace? It's up for debate on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. The Donbass is Ukraine's industrial heartland. It's an agricultural basin, rich in coal, has a lucrative steel manufacturing industry and vast untapped mineral reserves. And Russia wants all of it. As trilateral peace talks resumed, Russia was holding firm on its territorial demands.
Russia's position that Ukrainian armed forces must leave the Donbass territory, must be pulled out of there, is well known. It is a very important condition.
Russia currently controls about 90% of the Donbass, but Ukraine refuses to simply hand over the rest. Dug-in positions on both sides meant the two-day peace negotiations in Abu Dhabi ended without much progress. So, what compromises, if any, are on the horizon? On this episode, we'll debate if Ukraine should accept defeat in Donbass. US security guarantees have reportedly been agreed to. Can and should Ukraine rely on the US? And amid reports that some European leaders are considering reopening diplomatic channels with Russia, we'll ask our panel if that's good policy or bad timing. To debate the latest developments on the Russia-Ukraine deal, I'm joined by Richard Sakwa, Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Kent and author of the upcoming book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, Follies of Empire. Ray McGovern is with us, former CIA analyst of Russia and a gentleman who participated delivering the high-level daily briefs to President Ronald Reagan. So a lot of insight on security there. And Velina Tchakarova is with us, rounding out our panel. She's a European geopolitical strategist and political scientist, and we appreciate having all of you here on Counterpoints. Thanks for being with us. Well, we've heard from the Ukrainian side that recent trilateral talks held in the UAE covered a range of important issues, and the Kremlin has intimated that talks will resume again later this week. Even though the sides have struck a somewhat optimistic tone, the major sticking point remains, seems to be as intractable as ever: who will control the Donbass region? During its military campaign, Russia has seized the vast majority of the two oblasts. It wants Ukraine to hand over the rest, something that Kyiv, thus far, is unwilling to do. Velina, let's start with you. Should Ukraine admit defeat in the Donbass and start considering territorial concessions?
Well, as a matter of fact, Ukraine has already been pushed politically to territorial concessions. The very fact that we are now in this trilateral format between the United States, Ukraine and Russia is, in fact, a proof that the Ukrainian delegation is open to the idea of making certain concessions also on the territorial dispute. Now, what we do not know for a fact, because right now we have these important negotiations on the technical issues, is what exactly this kind of territorial dispute will be. I mean, of course, obviously we know that it's about Donbas, Donetsk and Luhansk. That's the territory which is now more or less mostly disputed because Russia wants the full control, and Ukraine, which still controls parts, in fact, 20% of Donetsk doesn't want to give it away, also for strategic concerns, because of fear of future military attacks that could be initiated. So this is now highly technical. It's up to the military representatives of both sides. And of course, the United States is in the lead in terms of mediating the process.
Mm-hmm. Richard, what do you make of Velina's comments there that Ukraine has already made concessions? Do you think, given the fact that Russia already controls about 10%, does it need to go further and hand over the rest? And if so, why?
It's a sort of, it's a de facto concession because it wasn't one made voluntarily, of course. It was made, first of all, over Crimea, now Lugansk and Donetsk. And of course, the other two in play, which are considered and part of in the Russian constitution, they're now listed, talking about Zaporozhye and Kherson oblasts. So there's a number of other issues in play. But indeed, this 15 to 20% of Donetsk is at the moment the sticking point. And more than that, for Ukraine, it is the part of the defensive fortifications. So it isn't just simply territory. It's also about long-term military security. There's a lot of ideas about how to deal with this. Initially, there was some sort of idea of demilitarization, foreign observers, monitoring mission, all sorts of ideas. But Russia is sticking to its position that these two, Lugansk and Donetsk, have to be transferred in their entirety. But this is, there's a larger issue, of course. What will be the status of these four territories plus Crimea? So as we move towards an end game, it's larger than that. You mentioned security guarantees, which we'll talk about later, but that's obviously part of the package.
Ray, how do you assess this dispute over territory? I mean, Ukraine is saying it's not up, Zelensky is saying it's not up to me to give it away. It's in the constitution. I can't hand it over. Russia is saying we won't settle for anything other than 100%. Where do you go from there?
I see it with profound sadness. Totally unnecessary. Almost 4 years ago, there was a deal. Zarakhamia on the Ukrainian side, others on the Russian side got together, and within 6 weeks of the actually outbreak of hostilities, they had a deal in Istanbul. It required no transmission of territories one way or the other. All it required was for Ukraine to say, okay, we will not become part of NATO. There would be a ceasefire, and there would be reasonable limits on the amount of armed forces on each side. That's all that was required. Arabiya signed on the dotted line, so did the Russians, and who came in but Boris Johnson? I'm not making this up. Arabiya has said precisely this, and he said, no, don't do that. Go with the West, and we'll fight for you as long as it takes. Very bad decision on the Ukrainian part. They decided to believe the United States and the Western assurances, and so 1 million Ukrainian soldiers have dead, probably 500,000 Russians, all because it was totally unnecessary, and that's why I look at it with profound sadness.
Velina, what do you think about that? Could this have all been avoided, or has Europe really been the instigators of what is now a very difficult negotiating position?
I respectfully disagree with this position. It was up to the Ukrainian leadership to decide whether this was a good negotiation position or not. The very fact that at that time, if we carefully remember the situation, the military situation in 2022, so it was a very different situation. Russia actually had attacked from 5 different directions. So altogether, it was around 30% of military control at that time. And in fact, Following this, let's say, failure of diplomatic efforts back in 2022, the reality is very different from geopolitical perspective, because Ukraine was able to exercise a successful counteroffensives. It has pushed the Russian forces, armed forces, from various areas. For instance, Kherson was a very, very successful military operation. And right now, we are at around less than 20% military control. I mean, the very fact that Russia is still desperately trying to achieve more on the diplomatic arena, combining this with this harsh military reality every day by attacking civilians, through drones and missiles, because Ukraine is still lacking the air missiles systems from Europe and from the United States, doesn't make the reality different on the front lines. And the reality is on the front lines is that in 2026, around 18% is under Russian control. None of the four oblasts, the four regions, are under complete military control of Russia. And that's the current situation from Ukrainian perspective, and from the perspective not just of the Ukrainian leadership, but also of the population of Ukraine, which has supported this leadership throughout the whole war effort.
Do you want to respond to any of that, Ray, before I go over to Richard for a different question?
Well, I just really, I can't get over my sadness, because what really happened was, after the coup in Kiev 2014, NATO built up the Ukrainian armed forces so that they were the best armed forces in Europe. And so the Ukrainian authorities felt there was no need to compromise. When NATO and the US says, fight on, well, we could probably win this. Totally unrealistic against a much bigger, much stronger, and much more powerful enemy on the other side of the line there. So again, the ironies are here. The deceptions of Minsk, both of those accords, admitted to. The betrayals were admitted to by both the Chancellor of Germany, Merkel, and the Prime Minister, or the President of France, Hollande. Oh yeah, we were just delaying things to give time enough so that the Ukrainian forces could be built up to NATO standards. The miscalculation was, yeah, the Russians had to build up, but they have, and it was inevitable. As a matter of fact, Obama warned back in 2015 it would be a bad mistake to tell the Ukrainians that they could contend with a much more powerful enemy on their border.
Richard, let me put this to you then. If Russia was so powerful and so much more capable, as Ray is saying there, I mean, Russia has been unable to take full control of the Donbass, despite more than a decade of this fighting, despite apparently their superior military. So if it could take it, wouldn't it have done so already?
It's not a decade. Yes, the conflict began effectively in 2014, and the Minsk Accords. I mean, it's very controversial about what was going on in the Donbass. There's one view that it was a civil war. In other words, a conflict within Ukraine, and that level of conflict, by the way, has not gone away even to this day. So, in my view, it's part of the settlement, as the Russians would call it, a type of civil. Peace, harmony within Ukraine, which respects the other Ukraine, that is Russophone, the multi-confessional, pluralistic Ukraine. So that's a whole level of analysis when we come to the end game, which will have to be sorted. The Russians call it denazification. I think that's a misleading term, but what it does suggest is that there's a cultural, civilizational element to the conflict. But the key point is that what was in the Minsk was a way of returning these parts of the two oblasts, Donetsk and Lugansk, back to Ukrainian sovereignty and jurisdiction. If only they made this internal peace. They couldn't do it because within Ukraine, the agenda was dominated by a type of homogenizing discourse, nationalizing discourse, accompanied by an extraordinary, how can I put it, Westernophilia, that the leadership lost, if you like, a sense of its own statecraft, which for a leader, which is to look after the concerns of their own people. They failed to do it. So it wasn't just a betrayal about Hollande and Merkel. It was of their own leaders. Zelensky, of course, was elected in 2019 as a peace leader. He said he would do everything possible for reconciliation. Very quickly, his discourse was captured and sabotaged by the extreme nationalist wing, which has dominated since, which has gone for a military solution. In 2021, the big issue was Tomahawk missiles. There's a whole stack of issues. That's why, we need to talk about this 15% of Donetsk, but that's only a small part of the larger picture. The Russians like to talk about root causes, and they have to be dealt with at many levels. It's like a Rubik's Cube. To get it all together means it's a very complex business. So I'm not sure that this discussion where we are now, these peace talks, can go very far. But just one final point. What's interesting now is that the United States is emerging as an attempt to act as an honest broker in its own way. But this is unique. Of course, Istanbul, it was without the United States and the Western alliance. Now we have. So we see the split in the Western alliance between the United States, Trumpian US, and the Europeans, who seem to be intent on continuing the war to some sort of conclusive, well, it can't be a victory, but some sort of defeat of Russia.
Velina, give me your thoughts on what you've heard, and also answer me this. How does President Zelensky balance this then? It's politically unpopular and constitutionally challenging to cede the territory, but it's also untenable to keep this conflict going indefinitely.
So let me just start with some clarifications what we have at stake before I actually respond to your question and what's next. Now, first and foremost, the strategic goals of Russia haven't changed at all. No matter what kind of ceasefire or political agreement will be reached, because that's my base scenario for 2026. We will talk about it as well. But let's be real about it. The strategic goals of Russia haven't changed at all. And the core of the strategic goal of Russia, when it comes to not just Ukraine, but this specific region, which Russia has been defining as the near abroad. I mean, think of the Monroe Doctrine or the Monroe Doctrine and how the Americans are defining their direct neighborhood. So basically, you get the idea how Russia has been defining its near abroad. And they are denying Ukraine its very existence as territory, as people, and as sovereignty. So the end goal here is still very much the same. And it doesn't matter really about the continuum because, and I will remind you of something else. First and foremost, the attacks on Eastern Ukraine between 2014 and 2022 would have never been actually possible without the military of Russia. So it was a military operation, of course, in a hybrid form, packaged in a hybrid form, coupled with the annexation of Crimea. And basically, you get the idea where we are right now, because between 2014 and 2022, we had countless ceasefires. Now, the problem is that most people were not paying attention at that time. Ukraine was not interesting, and was actually most of the people were not able to point Ukraine on the map. But it was the very same modus operandi, countless ceasefires, every time violated. And it was a source of legitimization, such as the one that is going to happen right now, which is not going to stop the war. It's just going to prolong the continuum of the end goal, which is, again, as I said, the full subjugation of Ukraine in a long period of time, no matter whether Putin is going to be still in power or not. The system that's in charge is going to take care of it. So now going back to Zelensky, and rightfully you asked the question, which is how is Zelensky being now in the position of representing the interests of its people, somehow navigating this completely different geopolitical reality. The Americans want stabilization of the old continent. They want to withdraw from Europe. They want the Europeans to take care of the continent's security. And at the same time, they know that they can do it only when a peace is achieved. So here is how I think it's going to happen. There's going to be a political agreement between United States and Russia. It's inevitable to happen because it serves these new strategic documents and this new, if you like, doctrine of this Trump administration. And it has nothing to do with Ukraine. It has nothing to do with Europeans. And you rightfully pointed out, of course, the Europeans are now quite on a different page when it comes to the relations with Ukraine and the relations with Russia. And what I think might happen is some sort of South Korea, North Korea armistice, some sort of peace without peace treaty, when the two delegations will come together under the guidance of the Americans and will sign some sort of paper which will actually initiate the ceasefire. Of course, with all the technicalities of a ceasefire, similar to what was happening before. Trust me, the Ukrainian and the Russian delegations, especially the military intelligence, they fully understand the complexity of the situation, but it is, I think, the most realistic scenario for 2026. And this is going to be something that the population will accept, because you clearly see what is happening right now with the winter conditions, weeks of minus temperatures, people without electricity, without actually water, and basically under the most, the harshest conditions, where all of these drones and missiles are falling down from the sky because Ukraine is still lacking the required arms, the required air missile defense.
May I interject
Please,
here?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Ray.
I agree that Russian goals have not changed. Ever since the coup in Kiev in 2014, Russia's goal was to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. Now, many of us have been saying that for years, but not until 2 years ago did the chief of NATO admit to that, Jens Stoltenberg, saying the Russians said, if you let or continue to want Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade. Stoltenberg. We said no, and so the Russians invaded. So there you have it. But we got two more members, Finland and Sweden. So we got two. It was that kind of mentality. Meanwhile, 500,000 by that time Ukrainian youth have died. There is not a scintilla, not little millimeter of evidence that Russia decided to do anything with respect to Ukraine, including Crimea, until the coup in Kiev. So we have to remember that that was a Western-sponsored coup, and that the Europeans who guaranteed that Yanukovych would not have to run, they also betrayed. I'm talking about the president of Russia now, okay? And the other observers from England and from Poland at the time. So the thing has a long history, but I agree that Russia had one aim. It looks like they're going to achieve that aim. And Donald Trump himself has said, I find it reasonable that Russia would not want Ukraine to be a NATO member on its border. As a matter of fact, if the Ukrainians don't make a deal now, says Trump, they'll probably lose the rest of that territory in the Donbas anyway. So why don't they make a deal now? For once, I agree with Trump on that one.
Velina, I'm going to get you to respond to that, but I'm going to move us on to our next segment first, and then we can circle back to some of those points, because one thing that has given Ukraine a little bit of extra confidence, perhaps, is the news that an agreement on US security guarantees has been reached. Let's take a listen to what President Zelensky said on Sunday in Lithuania.
For us, security guarantees come first. These are bilateral security guarantees from the United States. The document is 100% ready, and we are waiting for our partners to confirm the date and place when we will sign it.
Velina, We've seen the US be a very transactional partner in its foreign policy approach recently, and at times it's been accused of being an outright untrustworthy partner. Can and should Ukraine rely on the US for security guarantees?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the Ukrainian leadership recognized the need to have US security guarantees first and foremost. So the very fact that they did not go for European security guarantees first and foremost, but try to ensure that the Americans are involved militarily. There will be a military presence. There will be a perpetual military aid. And yes, of course, it's not going to be about NATO membership. But in this case, it doesn't matter really, because Ukraine will be actually invited to join the European Union, the common market. It's already the strongest European army on the old continent. It has already created interoperability with the Americans, with the American defense system. So in that way, I mean, this was certainly the wisest decision on behalf of the Ukrainian leadership to go after the security guarantees. And the security guarantees are strengthening the Ukrainian position in the negotiations, because you have to look at it from both perspectives. On the one hand, the Americans have weakened the Russian geoeconomic position because the sanctions that they have imposed and threat with secondary sanctions, this is certainly working and is decimating the revenues from oil and gas. And now that the Americans, together with their allies, have decimated also key partners and allies of Russia, think of the weakened, Iranian support. Think of also the problems the China is facing right now. Think of Venezuela, where Russia had a very, very strong position for its shadow fleet. I mean, you get the idea. The Russians are really being squeezed economically. And, this combination of strengthening the Ukrainian position and weakening the Russian position, so they both come to the negotiation table, I think is really the intersection point that is going to result in something meaningful.
Okay. All right. Richard, do you agree? Do you think it strengthens Ukraine's position, or does this promise of security guarantees just add another layer of complexity to negotiations? Does Russia view them as provocative?
So much of this talk in the last few months, we're talking from the 28-point peace plan, which was announced in November, and then in December it was modified by the European Union, who went to Washington and begged, and they got the 20-point peace plan. Now these discussions in UAE. There seems to be a sort of a fantasy element about it all, and we've just heard elements of that. First of all, what were the Russian analysis of its goals right from the start? The near abroad applied only to the former Soviet states. It was the Eastern European states were as a sort of middle abroad, but even then it was never a genuine sense of infringing on the sovereignty of neighbors. The Russian policy had always been to precisely maintain the sovereignty. I mean, Putin came in, he signed the deals, border agreements, everything. Let's accept everything as it is. But there was always this question of what are Russia's legitimate security interests. I've been asking this question for 20 years. In the old days, when I used to go to the British Ministry of Defence, I would ask this question. I never got an answer. In other words, the implicit assumption was they don't have any, because we are an expanding Western alliance system. And of course, Ukraine then became a willing element in this element. Obviously, Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO, but NATO was in Ukraine, as we've just heard. If Russia really wanted to annex these territories, as it were, if it was all about empire, they could have done for the bits of Donetsk and Lugansk all the way back from 2014, 15, 16. They didn't want it. The whole point of Minsk was to return it to a sovereign, independent Ukraine, but they mismanaged that, and Western sponsors, call them what you like, misguided. The US embassy in Kiev was some sort of proconsul's office, which, again, everybody talks about Ukrainian agency, which I want, genuine agency, independence, to think how it can save its people now, how it can actually live normally. Russia is not on its knees. We've just heard a very, I think, misleading analysis. Its economy, yes, it has huge challenges, but sanctions will not work. that this geoeconomic element is not going to change Russia's main goal, which is that there has to be no security threat from Ukraine.
So
Now
how does
or in
the
the future.
US security guarantees play into that then, though? Coming back to my question, does this add a dangerous level of complexity to negotiations?
It certainly does do that. But remember, it's also rather insulting for the so-called coalition of willing, that is, of the willing, that is Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and its allies, which have been talking for the last few months about they providing these security guarantees. And that's, as it were, been discarded with a rather contemptuous nod in these latest discussions. Yes, it does add a layer of complexity because Russia does not want to alienate Washington today under Trump. They want to see this rapprochement between Washington and Moscow, and it serves, I think, everybody's interests to see this. Of course, we all want some sort of equitable, fair solution to the Ukrainian crisis, but we're not getting it at the moment. Security guarantees is part of the mix, but it's not the solution. The solution has to go far deeper than that to ensure. And by the way, just one final point. Russia also, Putin himself, also has his own constituency to bear in mind, that he is considered far too soft and far too willing to have an agreement. And even just recently an interview, I won't give names, but they're basically saying that he really should be much tougher. I know I have every sympathy for the Ukrainians suffering so much now, but there has to be an acceptance that this is an unnecessary war, that the Ukrainians became effectively part of a larger onslaught to weaken Russia strategically. And there's a huge constituency in Russia which says, we will not accept this. So an armistice on the Korean style is not on the table. It's going to have to be the security threat from Ukraine will have to be removed, including the placement of missiles. And an 800,000 strong army is nonsense.
Okay.
So we're still on the base point, but sure, point naught in the negotiations ultimately.
Ray, I know you want to jump in. I can see it, but I just want to give Velina the right of reply there to balance our debate, and then I'm going to come to you.
Sure.
I see it differently. I mean, geostrategically, Russia will have always invaded Ukraine because it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the restoring the great power status of Russia, which now Russia has successfully achieved with this new US administration. Russia is back on the global arena together with China and United States, but it was not just because of the US. It was also because it strategically decided to side with China. It has built up this modus operandi of strategic coordination over the last 10 years, and then actually decided to make a move on Ukraine when it was at the height of its strength, because it was mentioned that it would have invaded earlier, but that's also not correct, because we saw actually the state of the Russian army in 2008 when they attacked Georgia. So basically, let's be real about it. I mean, Ukraine was really invaded by Russia, not because of any coups. There were no coups actually in 2013 and in the follow-up months. In fact, Ukraine was invaded because it was not a NATO member. And the reality as such is that now we have more NATO members close to the Russian border, and the behavior of Russia is completely different when it comes to the other NATO members, the new NATO members, for instance, when it comes to Finland. It's a very different behavior, which also comes to show that it's much more about the strategic goal also of destroying the European security order, of swallowing up Ukraine and actually getting all of this kind of territory and union together with Belarus and creating new facts on the ground, preparing for the 21st century global power projection. Now, going back to some rationale here, NATO is here to stay. We are going to have much stronger NATO along the eastern flank of NATO, including also cooperation with Ukraine, and that's a good thing for everybody. It's a good thing for the predictability of the European-Russia relation. in the future, and it's also good for the predictability of Ukraine-Russia relationship to avoid future scenarios of what I outlined as at least 10 years plan to actually subjugate the full of Ukraine. And for that matter, we need the Americans, but we need also the European NATO members. So they will also have to get their act together when it comes to actually participation and burden sharing. It's just a matter of time that this happens. And again, we are in a very different reality also when it comes to Ukraine, because Ukraine has been in a war, in a real war, since 2014. So right now there is also a lot of actually learning process when it comes to the European armies as a takeaway from the experience of Ukraine.
Okay. All right. Ray, jump in. I know that I interrupted you before. Go ahead now.
Security guarantees. From what? Now, NATO used to have Article 5 security guarantees. They are worth very little now, with NATO falling apart and very much at odds with each other. Will there be something less than Article 5 guarantees? Well, something less than that doesn't really matter. The more important question is, security against what? Now, there is no evidence that Russia decided to acquire Ukraine before the coup in Kiev in 2014. Even then, and even up till today, there are limited Russian designs. Now, President Biden can say, you think, in his last State of the Union address, anybody in this room think that Russia will stop in Ukraine and not go out to Poland and the Baltics, huh? Well, that's idiotic. The Russians already stopped in Ukraine. That's what I started with. April 2022, they stopped. There was an agreement. Arabiya initialed it. And you know what happened after that. So the notion that the Russians won't stop in Ukraine, of course they will. They already did. Will they go out to Poland? That's foolish. Would they go out to the Baltic states? I've been there, done that. I don't see any reason why the Russians would want to do that. And there is not a scintilla of evidence that they do. So, long story short, no Ukraine in NATO, no real reason for security guarantees. The Russians will be satisfied, and there will be a new realization that they are going to protect their own interests in the event of NATO infringement or infringement by anybody on their core interests.
Mm-hmm. Velina, give me your right of reply of that, and then I'm going to hand it over to Richard.
Yeah, I mean, very simple answer to that. So the security guarantees are actually meant to avoid any misjudgment of the situation in the future, which could lead to direct military clash between European NATO and Russia. So the risk of European NATO Russian military conflict remains as low as it was actually prior to 2022. There is no readiness on behalf of the European NATO countries to wage a war against Russia, and vice versa. So Russia doesn't want to wage a war against European NATO, not to speak of United States. But the point here is how to avoid any future situations, let's say misjudgment, misperception. And I think that in that case, security guarantees, I mean, first and foremost, of course, are meant for Ukraine, being not a NATO member, because yes, I agree, Ukraine will not receive NATO membership invitation. That's going to be, part of the political conditioning. Mm-hmm. But in order to avoid this scenario, that's one way how, you create actually a situation of avoidance, of containment, or let's say of denial. And I think that this is where we are moving right now. I mean, it's going to be something like a new Iron Curtain 2.0 along the eastern flank of NATO.
Okay, I'm going to move us to our next segment in just a moment, but Richard, I want you to weigh in on this topic before we do.
Yeah, the European security order was mentioned earlier, and this is the fundamental issue. Velina just talked about a new Iron Curtain. Yes, de facto it's emerging, but I think that this war will continue until. So the last thing we want is, and certainly the last thing Moscow is wanting, is another armistice. This is why I say the Korean situation is a very unlikely outcome. There has to be an outcome which deals with a far larger, a larger picture, bigger picture across the European continent, as it were, so that Russia's we're just not waiting for, if you like, a short armistice, like in 1918, before we start fighting again in 1939. This is madness. There has to be a far more sustained solution to this question, which hasn't been solved since 1991, is how do we get a pan-continental security order? In Washington, this is now being talked about. Kiev, of course, is the huge fishbone in the gullet, which is just stopping Europe moving on to some, and certainly from Washington's perspective, to establish this framework. Yes, we understand we want emerging out of this a free, sovereign, democratic Ukraine, but one which is neutral. And the security guarantees at the moment, it's so much of the Western allies talking amongst themselves, or Kiev talking to Washington. Where's Moscow in all of this? Yes, they've been talking now, finally, the military people in these talks just this last weekend, finally brought the military on board, talking to Budanov and so on. So we don't know the details, but there has to be a bigger solution rather than just an armistice, in which case, what would be the missiles in Ukraine? The whole thing about these Tomahawk missiles, I go on about it, but this was the discussion in December 2021, just before the war, again when Blinken met Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. These issues have the whole point. Russia's lost, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of men, Ukraine as well, that we need to get to some more sustainable peace order, not just a temporary end to fighting.
Mm-hmm. We're getting close to running out of time, so I'm going to move us to our final segment so we've got a little bit of room to breathe on this last topic, because there are concerns within the European Union that some leaders may be considering reopening diplomatic channels with Russia. Now, some say that's a good idea. France's Emmanuel Macron and Italy's Giorgia Meloni have flagged the possibility of restoring direct communication. That has other EU partners such as Poland worried. So, Ray, what do you think? Should EU leaders open direct channels with Russia?
Well, the answer is undeniably yes. And Putin, about a month ago, made a big thing of saying, okay, now Europe, it's really unfortunate what's happened over the last decade, but we're a European country and would like to deal. And even Chancellor Merz has said, yeah, well, actually, Russia is part of Europe and maybe we should talk. But the Russian reaction, and I can understand it, is, who are we going to talk to? Kaja Kallas? Just
well, why
over
not?
the weekend.
I mean, why not, though?
Well,
if she's Europe's representative, why do they treat her with derision?
Well, because I will quote Peskov, and he's Putin's spokesperson. It has nothing to do with the fact she's a woman. Let's let that one aside. She's not very smart. She didn't know that Russia and Japan helped. Russia and China helped win World War II. She thought it was all the Americans. She's just not very bright. And what she says is not really smart. And so she was really just a creature of Ursula von der Leyen. And so don't take it from me. Peskov said on Saturday, he said, look, we can't talk to this person. She doesn't know what agenda's up. Who are we going to talk to? And Macron? Macron has been kind of humiliated by Putin himself, saying Macron says this today and says this the next day. And the other people, the other three of the coalition of the willing, so to speak, they've shown themselves to be way out of their depth. So Russia would be willing to entertain, as Putin said, a dialogue with European once it's been chastened and realized it's not going to seize Ukraine. But who's to talk to? It's a very real problem.
Who do you think, if you had to give me one name?
I would say the Europeans ought to get together and nominate somebody, but so far they haven't been able to do even that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Velina, do you think that individual European countries should reopen direct lines of communications with the Kremlin?
Of course they should.
Oh, no, I'm going to hand this...
them.
I'm going to hand this one over to Velina now, because I'm going to guess she disagrees with your point there, Ray.
Okay.
Not necessarily, but I want to make a clarification that what I actually outline as a possible or realistic scenario for what I think might happen doesn't have to do anything with my normative thinking or the way how I actually see things based on my own values. So it has nothing to do with my personal values-based system. It has all to do with my professional career, where I try to outline the most realistic way of things, how things might unfold. And here again, I have to say, I think that it's inevitable to happen. I think that in the next months and probably year or two, there will be an inevitability for both European states and Russia to get to some communication channels, similarly as the Americans and the Chinese have relaunched important military-to-military communication channels to avoid unnecessary or dangerous situations of misjudgment or misperception. And here again, I mean, the calculus is the following. If United States is relaunching strategic dialogue with Russia for their own national interest, because they try to lure Russia away from the dragon bear, in the long run, I mean, there are now recalculations in some European capitals that there is a need for a European approach also to Russia in the post-peace period. Of course, all emphasis is being put on Ukraine and the integration of Ukraine into the European Union, as well as the launch of European military presence in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. All the stuff that we have already talked about. But the point here is that there is realpolitik calculus. It might come from Finland, it might come from Germany, it might come from Italy, it might come from France. So various capitals, as well as probably the European Union capital, which is Brussels. There are still some dependencies. There are still some issues which are burning issues in the short run. And again, I think it's inevitable to happen.
Velina, I'm going to pose the same question to you as I did to Ray. If you had to give one name, who do you think is the best placed?
I wouldn't say best placed, but I actually would name the Finnish the Finnish political figure, which is Alexander Stubb, who is actually quite familiar with the Russian calculus, and I think he's also on very good terms with the United States right now, with Trump, and I think it will be a very, very good representative of the European interests in, let's say, if it comes to some direct dialogue between Russia and Europe.
Okay, Richard, round out our debate for us. What's your position? Do you think Europe should reopen these diplomatic channels?
Yes, and it's only 4 years too late. It should have done this a long time ago. It's astonishing. We have a war on our European continent, and the major European leaders believe that they can just wage war. Even 2 years into the First World War, late, talking about December 1916, there were peace feelers, let's put it this way, and it was a path which could have gone forwards. Reyes mentioned the Istanbul talks earlier. We could talk about the various Minsk agreements. We could go back to 2013 when the association agreement was being discussed and the European Union leadership, when Moscow said we've got issues and concerns, the leadership of the European Union says, what's that got to do with you? Apart from the fact that Russia and Ukraine were for many years a single economic unit and so on and so forth. It was this arrogance of the European leadership, which is one of the big provocative factors which has provoked this war. Again, Ukraine then became, after 2014, a willing accomplice of these, in my view, very short-sighted policies. We're still... as you say, of course there should be dialogue, and it's astonishing even that it's raised as a question. The idea of Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, being a negotiator is, again, the West talking amongst itself. Yes, he plays golf with Donald Trump, so yeah, great. But of course, he's well known as being precisely one of the most hawk-like Russophobic elements in Finland. And if they're appointed, even the idea of naming him as a possible interlocutor in negotiation just shows how far the Western leaders and the Western position is from understanding the causes that provoked the war. It was not an imperialist war. It was a war about security, quite clearly outlined in the December 2021 treaties and a debate over 30 years about. It's not just NATO, the larger framework of security on the continent. There has not been a pan-continental
If not
order.
the Finnish leader, who do you think is a better candidate?
There is no one. There is no one in the European, including the United Kingdom, who has any respect in Moscow, who would be able to act as a genuine interlocutor. Of course, you then mentioned the Slovak or the Hungarian leaders, but they wouldn't have the backing of the Europeans. So Europe is, I'm afraid, and the fact that we're having this marginalized, it has suffered enormously economically. The idea of Ukraine joining the European Union next year, which is part of the 20-point peace plan, where the European leaders talk to each other. Yeah, I'd love to see it, but it'll mean a transformation of the European Union, a second-tier membership, who knows what. So this is, as I said, so much of the discussion for the last few months have been in some sort of fantasy world. And the hard reality is that we have to go back to basics. What was this war all about? And let's try to sort it out so that we do have an equitable solution for Moscow, for Kiev, for Brussels and Washington. That's where we have to start from.
That, unfortunately, seems like it could be a big ask. We are out of time, so I unfortunately have to leave it there because the insights across our panel have been really illuminating and we appreciate all of your diverse opinions. It's what we love here on Counterpoints. Richard Sakwa, Emeritus Professor of Politics and author, Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst of Russia, and Velina Tchakarova, the European geopolitical strategist. Thank you for your time here on Counterpoints. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Counterpoints. Keep up to date with our latest interviews and debates by subscribing to Al Arabiya English on YouTube and follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you for the next episode.